good to have you back. Something happened this week that I keep thinking about. I have a coffee maker I have used every morning for 4 years. Same process, same amount of water, same grind. I know what the result is supposed to look, smell, and taste like. Tuesday morning I followed the same steps and got something that was just slightly off, not wrong enough to throw out. Just wrong enough that I stood there and drank it slowly, trying to decide if it was me or the machine. That is, I think, the most unsettling flavor of wrong, not the dramatic kind. The kind that is almost right. That is what tonight's stories are built on. Familiar people, familiar places, familiar voices. Something in each of them was almost right, and the question every narrator had to sit with afterward was the same one. How long had it been almost right before they noticed? If you're new here, welcome in and stay. If you're returning, thank you, as always, for coming back. Subscribe if you haven't, because this is the kind of channel you return to when the rest of the night feels too quiet. Leave a comment if something in tonight's accounts lands close to home. We read them, headphones on, lights down. Let's go. What, Mrs. Alderton? Remembered my mother died in February. I'm telling you that plainly because the circumstances around the house and the village only make sense if you understand that I was already tired when I arrived there, and that tired people notice things later than they should. The house was a stone cottage in a village in the Cotswolds, where my mother had lived for 22 years. It was mine now, legally, and I had gone down to begin the process of sorting through it and listing it with an estate agent. I had arranged to stay for 5 days. I drove down on a Wednesday in October, and the village looked exactly as it always had. Low walls, the smell of damp stone, the last of the leaves coming down in the lane. My mother's neighbor, Mrs. Alderton, came around within the first hour. She was in her late 70s, well-organized, fond of my mother, and had been checking on the cottage since February. She was exactly as she had always been, neat coat, biscuits in a tin, full of quiet, practical concern. She had put the heating on before I arrived. She had aired the spare room. We sat in the kitchen and talked for an hour. She asked after my husband and my 2 children by name, in the right order. She said she had been missing my mother badly. She said the village felt different without her. At one point she brought up the summer. I was 14 and had stayed with my mother for a month, while my parents were arranging a house move. She said she remembered me helping in the garden. She said I had been so careful with the sweet peas, I deadheaded them every morning. She said right before breakfast. I smiled and agreed. It wasn't true. I had never had any interest in the garden at 14. I had spent that summer reading on the window seat and watching television. My mother had done the garden entirely by herself, as she always did. But the detail was the kind of small, warm misremembering that older people do, smoothing the past into something nicer. I didn't correct it. She left after an hour and I started on the sitting room boxes. The next morning she came back with milk and we stood in the kitchen again for 20 minutes. She mentioned my wedding. She said my mother had talked about it often. She said she remembered my mother telling her about the centerpieces. White roses, she said. Weren't they? No, cream freesias. I could name the florist and the exact arrangement. It had been one of the things I had cared about most. I said yes. That's right. I didn't know why I said yes. But something had shifted, and I wasn't yet able to say what. That afternoon I drove into the village center to check in with the estate agent and stop at the post office, which also served as the village shop. The woman behind the counter. I had known her vaguely for years. The way you know the permanent fixtures of your parents' neighborhoods asked how I was getting on. We talked briefly about the cottage. Then, on an impulse I cannot fully explain, I mentioned that Mrs. Alderton had been so helpful. The woman's expression changed. Not dramatically, she became careful. She said she was glad to hear that. Then she said she was sorry. She had assumed I'd have been told by now. Mrs. Alderton had passed away in March, about 3 weeks after my mother. It had been very sudden. The whole village had sent cards. I drove back to the cottage. I sat in the car in the lane for a while. I am not a person who reaches for dramatic explanations. I was tired and grieving, and I had been leaned on by something that was wearing a familiar shape, and my instinct, even in the car, was to find the sensible interpretation. Grief does strange things to perception. Stress makes you confuse people. Elderly women in a Cotswolds village might have a certain interchangeable appearance to someone who had visited only a handful of times over the years. I tried all of this on, but the biscuits were in the same tin that Mrs. Alderton had always used. I had eaten one, and I thought about what she had remembered. The dead-headed sweet peas at 14. She had told that story with the ease of someone who had heard it many times, not someone who had witnessed it, someone who had been told, and my mother had told it. The way you sweeten a child's past over years of retelling. My daughter was so helpful that summer, she dead-headed the sweet peas every morning. The story had become warm and softened, and whatever had been listening to my mother had learned it in the softened version. The white roses at the wedding. My mother had misremembered the flowers. I now realized I had corrected her gently years ago, and she had smiled and said yes. Cream freesias, of course. And she would have kept telling the story with the wrong detail because it was her version of it. Whatever had been sitting with her in that cottage had the wrong detail because that was the version she told it. Had been listening to my mother for years, not to me, to her, learning what she thought she knew, accumulating my history through her eyes, her memory, her particular set of mistakes. I called an estate agent in the nearest town, not the village agent. I arranged for a local clearance company to handle the contents. I did not go back to the cottage. I did not knock on the door of Mrs. Alderton's house. I did not want to know if anyone answered. I think about what the estate agent told me later. When the sale went through, the buyers had mentioned during their viewing that the neighbor had been very welcoming. A lovely older woman, they said. Very warm. She had known a lot about the previous owner. I asked which neighbor. They said the one to the left in Mrs. Alderton's cottage. I said I was glad the sale had gone smoothly. I have not been back to the village. My children ask sometimes why we never visit. I tell them it's complicated, and it is. I cannot explain to them what I'm actually afraid of, which is this. Whatever learned my history from my mother might have been learning my children's histories from me. Every time I have talked about them, every time I have used their names, I don't know when it started. Long my mother shared her home with something that was memorizing her version of our family. I don't know if she knew. I hope she didn't know. I don't know how long my mother shared her home with something that was memorizing her version of our family. I don't know if she knew. I hope she didn't know. What Pak Dani already knew I want to say first, that I know how this sounds. I've said it to my mother and she didn't think it was strange at all, which is its own kind of problem. I've said it to my cousin and he told me to pray more. I don't know what the right response is, I'm just telling you what I noticed in the order I noticed it, because that's the only honest way I have. I was 22 and working nights at a fish processing facility in Bitung on the northeastern coast of Sulawesi. The work was cold and loud and repetitive, which suited me because I was saving money and I didn't want to think very much. We packed mackerel and skipjack onto ice trays, sealed the crates, and moved them to the loading dock. It was hard work, but I knew the floor after 6 months, and I was reliable enough that the line supervisor left me mostly alone. In late August, a new worker arrived for the night shift. He was introduced as Pak Dani, mostly alone. In late August, a new worker arrived for the night shift. He was introduced as Pak Dani. He looked to be in his mid-40s, heavy-set, careful-moving, the kind of man who gets through hard work by never wasting effort. He was given an orientation by the floor supervisor, where the aprons were, where to stand, how the line moved, and then he worked. The first thing I noticed was that he was already good at it. Not in the way that someone with transferable skills picks things up fast, good in the specific way of someone who knows this facility. He knew that the third tray on the right conveyor had a slow-release mechanism, and that you had to pre-position the seal before it arrived. He knew that the drainage at the far end of the line backed up if you didn't clear it every 40 minutes. He knew these things on his first night without being told. I told myself he had worked somewhere similar before. I told myself these things were probably standard. I found a reason for each thing, and I moved on. On his third night, during the break period, Pak Dani sat down beside me near the loading dock doors. We talked a little. He asked where I was from originally. I said Makassar. He nodded. He asked if my sister still lived there. I hadn't mentioned a sister. I said yes. He nodded again and said she was doing well now, wasn't she? The restaurant work was steadier than before. I was glad for her. My sister had been struggling with an inconsistent hospitality job for most of that year. I knew this because I had spoken to my mother on the phone 3 nights earlier, outside in the facility parking lot, about exactly this. I had said out loud on the phone that I was glad the restaurant work was getting steadier, word for word, and I had not mentioned it to anyone at the facility. There was no reason to. It was a private, ordinary family update. Pak Dani had not been outside that night. I had looked back at the facility doors when I hung up. The loading dock was lit. There was no one near the entrance. I went to the shift supervisor the next morning, before the day crew came in. I said I wanted to verify the new workers file, that I had a discrepancy I was following up on for the safety audit. The supervisor found the folder for new hires from that week. Pak Dani was not in it. He checked the full facility register going back 3 months. No listing. He checked the contractor registry, the temp agency rotation list. Nothing. He was not apologetic about this. He was confused. He had seen the man on the floor. I had told him on which line. I asked 3 other workers the following night whether they remembered Pak Dani. 2 of them said yes immediately. When I asked them to describe him, one said he was a thin man, young, maybe 30. The other said he was older, medium build, light-colored jacket. Neither description matched the man I had spoken to on the loading dock, heavy-set dark jacket, mid-40s. The third worker I asked said she didn't remember anyone new starting that week. Pak Dani was not on the floor for the rest of that week. I did not see him again. What I have thought about since whatever was standing on that line knew the specific words I had used on the phone to my mother. Not the fact the words I was glad it was getting steadier. Exactly those words delivered back to me as reported information. Like something had been listening to me speak privately and was using what I had said to demonstrate that it knew me, that it had been paying attention. I don't know what it wanted. I don't know if it wanted anything. Maybe it was just showing me that it knew. Maybe that was the whole point I transferred to the day shift 2 weeks later. I put in the request as a scheduling preference. I did not explain the real reason, which is that I did not want to be on the floor at night anymore, in a facility that had no record of someone I had spoken to. I did not want to be known by something that I had not noticed knowing me. The Habitation Field. I am a tax compliance auditor from Bucharest. I review property registration documents for the State Revenue Authority. I have done this for 14 years. I'm telling you my profession so you understand that I am not a person given to embellishment. I work with documents. I rely on what is written. In 2019, I was sent to audit a rural commune in northern Transylvania, a cluster of about 400 residents and a municipal office that had not been properly digitized. All records were still physical binders. I was there to cross-check property ownership against the central database. The municipal clerk gave me the binder for one of the rural roads without comment. I opened it. Standard format: parcel number, owner of record, legal status, habitation field for current occupant or inspection responsible entry for parcel 14. Owner Gheorghe Buzatu, deceased, 1987. Habitation field for current occupancy in that field, in ink that matched the age of the rest of the document. Someone had written my name, my full name, first, middle, last, including the middle name I rarely use professionally. The middle name that does not appear in the Revenue Authority database or on my work identification. It is on my national identity document and essentially nowhere else. I checked the ink, old, dry. I held the page at an angle. The impression of the pen matched the surrounding entries. I checked the adjacent pages, documents from the 1980s and 1990s, all consistent aging. My name had been written there long before I was assigned to this commune, long before this audit cycle existed. I asked the clerk carefully what the habitation field typically indicated. She said it was sometimes used by the prior assessor to log who would be responsible for the next inspection cycle. The prior assessor had last visited this commune in 1991. I am a precise person. I noted the entry, photographed it for my own records, and when I filed the final audit, I marked it as a transcription error. Prior assessor notation incorrectly formatted. I closed the file. I have not requested a return assignment to that commune. I do not know what is in house number 14. The owner of record has been dead for 36 years. The Habitation Field listed my full name before I was ever sent there. I have not found an explanation that satisfies me. I am still looking for one, which is probably why I have not been able to stop thinking about it. Because in 14 years of auditing, I have never encountered a document I could not eventually explain. This one I could not explain. I marked it as an error and I moved on. That is, I think, its own kind of answer. The rule about the river, this is going to sound like I'm building towards something mystical. And I want to say up front that I am a structural engineer and I do not find that framing comfortable. What I can tell you is that the engineering record supported what Don Aurelio told me from the beginning, and I ignored him, and 3 people were hurt, and the bridge is fine. The bridge has always been fine. The bridge is not the problem. I was contracted by the municipal government of a small town in Antioquia to perform a load-bearing assessment of a colonial-era pedestrian bridge, stone arch constructed in 1748, still in daily use. My job was to inspect the masonry, take core samples, evaluate the drainage, and produce a certification report. The site supervisor was Don Aurelio, 62. Local, had worked construction in that valley his entire adult life. He knew the bridge the way a person who grew up beside something knows it. On my first morning, he told me plainly, they did not work on the bridge on Tuesdays or Thursdays. I asked why. He said it was the river. He said the bridge was old, and the river had an arrangement with it, and that some things in the valley were older than the current ownership of anything. I noted this in my site log as a local custom, scheduling consideration. I scheduled core drilling for the following Thursday, because that was when my equipment contractor was available. Don Aurelio and his 2 regular workers did not come in. My site log as a local custom. Scheduling consideration. I scheduled core drilling for the following Thursday, because that was when my equipment contractor was available. Don Aurelio and his 2 regular workers did not come in. I worked that Thursday with 2 engineers brought in from Medellin. The drilling rig failed on the first run. Not a catastrophic failure. A seized component that should not have seized on a new machine. We lost 3 hours. When we finally got it running, a cable on the testing rig snapped, which was more serious and required us to brace manually. Late in the afternoon, one of the Medellin engineers slipped on the bridge walkway and fell hard against the railing. Dry surface, no visible reason for the slip. He sprained his wrist badly and we stopped work for the day. Don Aurelio was back on Friday and said nothing about any of it. He worked. He did not say I told you so, which I would have preferred because at least I could have dismissed him. That evening I asked him directly, what does the arrangement actually mean? He sat with the question for a moment, then he said the river had been there before the bridge and would be there after it. He said the bridge had been built by people who understood this, and that the rule was in the original construction. He said it the way he would explain a load-bearing calculation as a structural fact, not a superstition. I had already requested the original construction documents from the municipal archive for the historical section of my report. I had a translation done over the following week. The 1748 notes from the Spanish engineer who built the bridge included the following in the section on foundation scheduling: that all pile work and masonry setting had been performed on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays only, by agreement with the local community, and that the engineer noted this as a local custom, which he would not argue with, as the community had been building near this river for longer than his own government had been aware of the valley. Don Aurelio's rule had been in the construction documents for 276 years. I certified the bridge. Included the following in the section on foundation scheduling: that all pile work and masonry setting had been performed on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays only, by agreement with the local community, and that the engineer noted this as a local custom which he would not argue with, as the community had been building near this river for longer than his own government had been aware of the valley. Don Aurelio's rule had been in the construction documents for 276 years. I certified the bridge in my report. I listed the Thursday incident as equipment anomaly and worker injury, cause undetermined, no further investigation warranted. It is a truthful sentence that I am not proud of. I did not schedule any further work on Tuesdays or Thursdays. I finished the assessment on a Wednesday and filed the report from my hotel room. 3 months after I submitted, the municipality forwarded me a message from the two Median engineers. Both had filed workers' compensation. The one with the wrist sprain had required surgery. The joint had not healed correctly. The other engineer, who had not been injured on the day, had been admitted to hospital 2 weeks after the assessment with a vertigo condition he described as feeling. Since that Thursday on the bridge, that the ground was not quite level in places where it should be. The condition was not improving. I have thought carefully about my culpability in this. The bridge is structurally sound. I certified it correctly. Neither injury is my professional fault under any framework I'm aware of. But Don Aurelio told me on the first day. He had the right information from the beginning. The original engineer in 1748 had the right information. They both described it the same way. Not a spiritual rule, not a religious prohibition, just a fact about the river, a load-bearing condition, in effect, for the relationship between that stone and that water. I don't work in that valley anymore. I did not seek return contracts there. I have not spoken to Don Aurelio since the assessment closed. I think about calling him sometimes. I don't know what I would say. I think I would want to tell him that I found the 1748 document, that he was right, and the original engineer was right, and I was the only one who didn't listen. He knew that already. That's the thing. He knew it the whole time. Vocal Ref 7. I'm going to be precise because that's how I work. I'm a sound engineer in Lagos and I have been doing sessions professionally for 8 years. I know my own project files. I know what I put in them. The session in question was a 4-day instrumental mix for a fashion brand video. No vocals at all. No vocal reference tracks. No scratch takes. 8 tracks total. 2 synth layers. 3 percussion elements, bass, a string pad, and a master bus chain. I knew the file completely. On the 4th day, I opened the project to do final exports. The session loaded. When I looked at the track list, there was a 9th track, Vocal Ref 7. I had not created this track. The project had never had a vocal ref track. There was no vocal ref 1 through 6. The track had a waveform. I checked the level. It was a voice recording. I pressed play. The recording was my name. Once, clearly, the way you say a name when you want someone to look up from what they're doing. A daze, then 12 seconds of silence, then my name again. Then the recording ended. I checked the metadata. The track had been created at 3:14 a.m., 4 nights earlier. My session log confirmed I had closed the project at 11:40 p.m. that night. My computer system log showed it had entered sleep mode at 11:58 p.m. and had not exited sleep mode until I opened the lid at 8 a.m. the following morning. A track had been created in a closed session on a sleeping computer at 3:14 in the morning. I deleted the track. I did not save the session file. I opened a fresh project and rebuilt the mix from scratch and delivered it. I now close the studio door when I sleep. I power the computer fully off. Not sleep mode. I've done this every night since. 3 weeks later, a friend messaged me. She had borrowed my studio for a day session and found a text file in the project folder titled Note for A. She sent me a screenshot. The file contained one word. My name. Just my name, written once. She said she assumed I had made a note and forgotten about it. She thought I should know. I had not created that file. I checked the creation date. It was from the same night as the vocal track, 3:14 a.m. Same minute. I have not opened that session folder since. Whatever put my name in that file did it twice in the same minute in 2 different formats, and then apparently waited 3 weeks for someone to find it. I don't know what it was trying to tell me. I don't know if it was the same event or two parts of the same one. Used my name the way you use someone's name when you want to make sure they're paying attention. I am paying attention. I do not know what to do with that. What I know is that it used my name the way you use someone's name when you want to make sure they're paying attention. I am paying attention. I do not know what to do with that. The birch at kilometer 12. I'm going to describe this with the same approach I use in my work, which is land registry, and which means I'm going to be specific about measurements and observations, because that is how I know I'm not confusing myself. I drove the access road to my family's property in northern Ontario 12 times over the course of my adult life before the day I'm describing. The road is a gravel logging track that branches off the main highway and runs approximately 12 kilometers to our lot. It is marked on paper survey maps. It is not reliably on GPS. I have driven it in all seasons, including winter, and I know its features. At kilometer 12, there is a dead birch tree at the junction, where a secondary spur branches right toward an old cut area. The tree has been dead since I was a child. It was struck by lightning at some point in the 1980s and is still standing, partially blackened, roughly 10 meters tall. It is a reliable landmark. I always note it when I pass. I drove out in September, clear day, dry road. I passed the birch at kilometers 12 and turned onto the main track toward the property. I noted the tree as I always do, continued driving. After approximately 3 kilometers, I reached a junction. The same birch was at the corner of the junction. I had not turned, I had driven straight. The road I was on was a straight continuation of the access track. There is no second junction at kilometer 15. There is no second dead birch tree. I have driven this road 12 times. There's one birch and one junction, and I was looking at it again. I turned around, I drove back the way I came. I passed the original Kilometer 12 junction. The birch was there and continued out to the highway. I checked my odometer. The distance was consistent with having driven in and out on the correct road. Nothing was wrong with the numbers. The road had delivered me out correctly. I turned around a second time and drove back in. I drove past the birch at Kilometer 12, counted carefully on the odometer at 3. I drove past the birch at KM 12, counted carefully on the odometer. At 3, 2 kilometers past the junction, the road ended at a dead-end spur. There is no dead-end spur on this road. I have driven past this point 9 times that I can remember. It has never dead-ended here. The birch was at the end of the spur, 10 meters ahead of me, at the center of a small turnaround area that should not exist. There was orange survey tape tied around the trunk of the birch, knotted, not loose, at about chest height. I have never seen it before. Survey tape, on a standing snag in the middle of a logging road, has a practical meaning in my work. It means someone flagged the tree for observation, for hazard assessment, or for removal. Someone had been here and had marked this tree. I did not get out of the car. I want to be clear about the reason I am not a dramatic person. And I had sat in that car for a moment and understood very precisely that I did not want to be out of the car on a road that was not behaving correctly. I backed out. I drove to the highway. I called my brother from the shoulder of the road. He drove the road 2 weeks before me. He says there is one junction, one birch, no dead end, no tape. He's right, of course. That's what I found on 12 previous drives. I asked him, had the road ever looped on him? He said no. He said, it's a straight road. He said it in the way you say something obvious. I have not been back. My brother now manages the property maintenance alone, which he finds inconvenient and does not understand. I told him I have too much on with work. That is true. It is not the reason I pulled the survey history for that road section when I got back to the office. I have access to this through my work. The road was last formally surveyed in 1997. The survey field notes include one descriptive observation for Kilometer 12, one standing birch snag, dead, lightning struck, estimated to fall within 5 years. That was in 1997. The tree is still standing. I don't know who tied tape around it. I don't know when the road started ending somewhere. It doesn't end. I don't know what the turnaround area was or who made it. I know that a dead tree that should have fallen 27 years ago is still there, and someone marked it recently, and the road showed me something that day, which it has never shown me before or since. My brother drove it last month without incident. He says it's fine. I believe him. I also believe what I measured with my own odometer. Both of those things can be true. I've decided to live with that, which is easier than the alternative. The handprints behind the cabinet. I'm going to say this plainly, because I've been trying to find a way around it for 2 years and there isn't one. My mother died after a long illness. She had lived for 15 years in a house in a small town in Rajasthan. She moved there to care for her own mother, who has also since passed, and when she died, I traveled from Pune to settle her estate. I had visited that house perhaps 4 times in 15 years. I did not know it well. On my second day there, I was clearing the kitchen, preparing the walls for the estate agent's photographs. I moved a large cabinet that stood against the interior wall, the kind of cabinet that has not been moved in a long time. Behind it, on the plaster, at approximately 1 meter from the floor, were 2 handprints, children's handprints. Both hands open, palms pressed flat, made with something like red paint or dye. The span and proportion of a child about 7 years old. My mother moved to that house when I was in my early 30s. I was never a child in that house. I was never 7 years old in that house. I measured the handprints. Then I held my own hand, palm out, against the wall beside them, and attempted a rough proportional comparison. Left hand, I have a scar ridge across the upper palm from a fall I took at age 6. The left handprint on the wall has an interruption in the surface contact at exactly that position, a gap in the print, the shape of a small healed cut. I stood there for a long time. I'm ashamed to say I cried. I'm not sure what I was feeling. It was not entirely fear. I don't know what it was. I did not photograph the wall. I moved the cabinet back. I told the estate agent the wall behind it was in poor condition and not suitable for the listing photographs. What I keep returning to is this. My mother lived in that house for 15 years. She knew what was behind that cabinet. She kept them covered and she never mentioned them to me, not once. Cabinet. I don't know why I hope that. Not in the final weeks when she was telling me other things she had held back. Not ever. She knew. She kept them in the dark behind the cabinet, and she never told me what they were or how they got there, or what she understood them to mean. I don't know if she was protecting me from the question or protecting the handprints from being removed. I don't know which of those possibilities is harder to sit with. The house sold quickly. I hope the new owners don't move that cabinet. I don't know why. I hope that. Cabinet. I don't know why I hope that. I'm not sure it would matter now, but I hope it anyway. Seven tonight. I hope you're all right. That last one will stay with me for a while. The thing she chose not to tell him. These aren't instructions. You don't have to do anything with any of this, except notice that tomorrow morning, whatever routine you follow, you're going to follow it just a little more carefully. You're going to listen just a little harder to whether the result sounds right. That's all. That's enough. Good night.